Everyone underestimated her new guard until the first attack. The alarm had already been silenced by the time I reached the east corridor of Arveth 9 station. 3 operatives were neutralized. The ambassador was alive, and the woman standing between them was bleeding from a cut on her forearm, looking at me the way you look at someone who is very late to a party they were not invited to. Her name was Marin Calloway. I had spent 2 days quietly believing she was a mistake. Let me be honest about that, because the rest of this account requires it. When Ambassador Lyra Demas arrived at Arveth 9 with her new guard, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary she looked. Marin Calloway was 170 centimeters tall, no powered armor, no visible augmentations. A standard-issue sidearm that looked like it had been through 2 decades of hard use. Dark eyes that moved constantly, but gave nothing back. She shook my hand when we were introduced, held eye contact for exactly long enough to be unsettling, and asked me one question before I had finished my opening briefing. What is your extraction route if the summit hall loses power? I did not have a clean answer. I fumbled through 2 options, neither of which I was fully satisfied with. She nodded once, said nothing further, and turned back toward the ambassador. I told myself she had read the briefing documents and was simply reciting them. I told myself she was performing competence. I told myself a lot of things over the next 48 hours that turned out to be completely wrong. Arveth 9 is a neutral diplomatic station in contested space. 43 delegations were present for the trade summit, representing species from 6 different stellar federations. At least 4 of those delegations had active intelligence operations running during the summit. This was not a secret. It was simply the way these things worked. You came to the table, you smiled, you signed documents, and somewhere in a locked maintenance bay, people who worked for you were trying to destroy the people who worked for everyone else. I was the coalition's attaché for security coordination. My job was to make sure those invisible operations stayed invisible, and that nobody died before the ink dried. I had done this job for 22 years. I was good at it. The Yhazari delegation had arrived on day 1 with 9 members and a very reasonable set of public demands. Privately, they were furious. A trade accord being negotiated between the Coalition and the Delvran Compact would reroute 3 hyperspace lanes that the Yhazari had profited from for 60 years. The accord was not a hostile act. It was simply business that did not include them. And in the Azari view of the universe, business that excluded them was a wound that required a surgical response. Their target was Lyra Demas. She was the architect of the accord. Without her, the negotiations would collapse for at least 2 years. 2 years was enough time to redraw the terms. Killing her was not a declaration of war, it was a market correction. I did not know any of this on day 2 of the summit. I was watching Marin Calloway on the security feeds and trying to understand what I was seeing. She did not stand the way bodyguards usually stand. Most protection personnel are trained to be visible, because visibility is its own deterrent. They position themselves to be seen and to be understood as dangerous. Marin did the opposite. She made herself easy to look past. She stood slightly behind the ambassador's left shoulder, never in front, never between Lyra and the people she was speaking with. She seemed to encourage people to forget she was there. I watched her do it with the Drath cultural attaché, with 2 members of the Delvran team, with a pair of station security officers who stopped to greet the ambassador. They all forgot her, and while they forgot her, she watched every single one of them with the calm, complete attention of someone who had nothing else to do in the universe except watch. On day 2, at approximately 3 in the morning during the station's night cycle, I passed her in a maintenance corridor on level 4. She was alone. She was pressing the panel seams with her fingertips, moving in a slow, deliberate circuit of the junction, counting something under her breath. She was testing the walls. She was mapping the structural tolerances of the corridor with her hands, the way you do when you want to know exactly which panels could be pushed through in an emergency, and which would hold. She looked up when she heard me. She did not look surprised or embarrassed. She looked at me the same way she always did, which was with absolute, uncanny steadiness. The station schematic shows a maintenance junction at the end of this corridor, she said, but the panel spacing is about 4 centimeters shorter than the schematic indicates. Something was modified, and the documentation was not updated. I looked at the corridor. I had walked it a dozen times. I had not noticed. I will have someone check it, I said. I already filed a report, she said. An hour ago. Good night, Commander. She went back to pressing the panels. I filed her secondary report under routine anomaly and did not think about it again until 2 days later, when it turned out to be the most important document in the entire incident record. The Wisari attack was elegant in the way that things are elegant when someone has spent a great deal of time and money making them so. They introduced a cognitive disruption compound into Arveth 9's atmospheric circulation grid through that non-standard junction in Sector 7, the one Marin had flagged and I had filed away. The compound targeted the neural architecture common to most species in the station. It did not cause unconsciousness. It caused a specific, temporary confusion, a strong and completely convincing sense that you were somewhere else, that you had already cleared your post, that your current location was handled, and you were needed in a different sector. It lasted 90 seconds. It was enough. I came back to myself standing in the corridor outside the main summit hall, staring at a wall. There was an acrid taste in my mouth from the counter-agent the station's automated system had deployed. For a moment, I did not know how I had gotten there. Then I heard something from inside the hall. Not a gunshot, a sound like furniture striking the floor very hard and very fast. I ran. The door was not locked. I pushed through it and stopped. The summit hall was a large, low-lit space. Long tables arranged in concentric arcs facing a central podium. 2 of the Wisari operatives were on the floor. A third was kneeling near the podium, his hands clasped behind his head, his eyes on the ground, breathing in the controlled way of someone who has been told very clearly what will happen if they do anything other than kneel and breathe. Ambassador Diemus was against the far wall, not hiding, not crouching, standing straight with her hands at her sides, and her expression very serious. She was unharmed. Marin was between the ambassador and the kneeling operative. She was holding her weapon at a relaxed angle that was not actually relaxed at all. There was a cut across her left forearm. The sleeve of her jacket had been opened along 8 centimeters of the fabric, and the cut beneath was shallow but clean, the kind that comes from something very fast-moving very close. Her breathing was completely even. She looked at me when I came in. She assessed me the way she assessed everything, in under a second, and then she looked back at the operative. "Station medical," she said. "Already called," I said. She nodded. I walked the room. 3 Wisari operatives, all in unmarked gear, all carrying weapons designed to leave no forensic signature. The first 2 were down hard. I read the room the way soldiers learn to read rooms, by looking at where things had moved and in what direction and how fast. The scuff patterns on the floor told me the engagement had lasted under 2 minutes from first contact. The position of the first operative suggested he had come through the service entrance behind the podium and moved left, toward the ambassador, and that he had been stopped before he reached the midpoint of the hall. The second had come from the east side. He was in a worse position than the first. The third had apparently reconsidered. The whole thing was written in the floor and the furniture and the specific way the bodies had come to rest. And what it told me was that a single person, given roughly 90 seconds of full function before the cognitive compound degraded her enough to matter, had done all of it. I asked Marin, quietly, if she was all right. She said yes. She asked if the station medical team had been contacted. I said yes. She nodded and turned back toward the ambassador and said something low and steady that I did not catch. And Ambassador Demas looked at her for a moment, and then exhaled very slowly, the way you exhale when the thing you were holding your breath for is finally over. That was the whole conversation. The debrief took most of the next day. The Hazari delegation was removed from the station under coalition security escort, which is a very polished way of describing a process that left no room for argument. The summit was suspended for 18 hours, and then resumed because Ambassador Demas requested it resumed, and when Lyra Demas requested something in that particular tone of voice, it happened. During those 18 hours, I accessed Marin Calloway's full service record for the first time. It had been flagged above my operational clearance for the duration of the summit, which meant I had spent 2 days evaluating her with nothing but surface information. This was standard procedure when a principal's guard had active intelligence connections. I had accepted it and moved on. I should have pushed harder on it before we arrived, but I had not pushed harder, because some part of me had already decided there was not much to find. I read her record from the beginning. It took 2 hours. I read it a second time more slowly. 15 years of service in close protection, most of it in environments where extraction support was hours away or non-existent. 11 separate incident reports, all of them ending with the principal alive. 3 commendations for conduct under fire. 1 formal citation from the Coalition Diplomatic Security Council, which they give out rarely and only for situations that defy easy description. A psychological evaluation note from a superior officer that read, "Calloway does not perform under pressure, she operates under pressure. The distinction matters." There was a section in the medical and biological records. I had seen versions of this section before, in human personnel files, but I had not applied it to her because I had not thought it relevant. I read it now with the specific and uncomfortable attention of someone learning that they have been looking at a situation completely wrong. Human beings, the report explained in the dry language of clinical assessment, present a unique biological profile in cognitive disruption scenarios. Most species with comparable neural architecture show functional impairment at exposure levels above 50 parts per million of the compound the Wajid-Zari had used. At 90 parts per million, which was the concentration deployed in the summit hall, most species experienced full suspension of executive function for the duration of exposure. The coalition security team, my team, went down at that level. Every member of it. Marin Calloway had been exposed to the same concentration. She had experienced approximately 40 seconds of fully unimpaired function before the compound began to degrade her cognition. For the next 50 seconds, she had operated at reduced capacity, which the report described clinically as impaired spatial reasoning and slowed processing speed, but functional motor control and intact threat response. After 90 seconds, the station's automated counteragent had cleared the compound from the atmospheric mix, and she had returned to full function. She had 40 good seconds and 50 impaired ones. She had used all 90. The biological basis of this was, the report noted, a product of several factors that made humans exceptional in this specific context. A high tolerance for chemical agents developed through centuries of exposure to variable environments. A nervous system architecture that distributed cognitive load differently than most species, and a pain response system that maintained motor function well past the threshold where other species began to shut down. It was not a superpower, it was not a special ability, it was simply what humans were, and in those 90 seconds, it was everything. I sat with the record for a long time. After I finished reading it, I thought about the corridor on night 2 and the panel she had been testing with her fingertips. I thought about the report she had filed, which I had categorized as routine and not pursued. I thought about her first question to me, about the extraction route if the hall lost power, and the look on her face when I had fumbled the answer. Not judgment, just the expression of someone confirming information they had already suspected. She had known the junction was wrong. She had filed the report, been told it was a maintenance variance, and then prepared for the possibility that nobody would take it seriously. She had spent day 2 and day 3 operating as though an attack was coming, not because she had proof, but because the junction was wrong, and someone who meant harm might already know that. She had not been surprised when the operatives came through. She had simply been ready. I found her near the docking level an hour before departure. The ambassador was aboard the shuttle, and Marin was doing one final check of the boarding corridor, the same methodical circuit she had been doing since day 1. Testing, mapping, counting. I asked her the one question I needed answered. When did you know it was coming? She stopped her circuit and looked at me. Day 1, she said. The junction in Sector 7. The spacing was wrong by 4 centimeters. That is not a maintenance variance. That is a modification. Someone opened that panel and closed it again, and did not update the documentation, which means either the station has a record-keeping problem, or someone did not want the modification on the record. You filed the report. I filed the report, she said. And then I treated the situation as though the report would not matter, because sometimes it does not matter, and the ambassador's safety does not change depending on whether paperwork is processed correctly. I asked her why she had stayed close to the wall during day 3 of the summit. I had noticed it on the feeds. She had been tighter to the wall than her position required. Fewer angles, she said simply. If something came through the main entrance or the service door, the wall behind me meant I only had to cover 180 degrees instead of 360. It costs nothing, and it changes everything if the situation goes wrong. She said it the way you say something obvious, the way you describe putting on a jacket when it is cold outside. I thought about 22 years of doing this job. I thought about the things I had assumed without examining them, and the assessments I had made in the first 10 seconds of meeting her, and the report I had filed as routine and forgotten. I thought about how close it had come, not because Marin had been underprepared, but because the people responsible for backup had not taken seriously the one person in the building who was already ahead of the threat. I did not apologize. I was not certain she wanted one, and I was not certain I could make one feel honest rather than self-serving. Instead, I said what I actually meant, which took some effort to locate. "You were right about the junction," I said. "I should have acted on your report immediately." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Yes, you should have." No anger in it, no sharpness, just the fact, stated cleanly, and then she moved on. I watched her board the shuttle and take her position beside Ambassador Demas, and the door closed, and they were gone. That evening, I wrote the incident report. Official language, the kind that goes into coalition records and gets read by people who make decisions about policy and protocol. I wrote that the ambassador's guard had identified a critical infrastructure anomaly before the attack, had filed the appropriate report, had maintained a heightened threat posture throughout the summit, and had neutralized 3 armed operatives during a coordinated attack with 0 casualties on the protected principal's side. I wrote that her performance was exemplary. I also wrote a separate internal memo, not for the record, just for myself, the kind of writing you do when you need to be honest somewhere, even if it is only on a page no one else will read. I wrote that I had looked at Marin Calloway and seen what I expected to see instead of what was actually there. I wrote that she had been ahead of the situation from the moment she walked into the building, and that I had spent 2 days being certain she was not good enough for the job. She was already doing better than anyone else in the room. I wrote that the only reason this was an incident report and not a casualty report was because she had done her job in spite of the fact that I had not fully done mine. Then I wrote one last line, the only one I kept from the draft to the final version. I wrote, "In 22 years, I have met very few people who made me feel like a student. I met one this week. She never once made it my problem." I filed the report. I closed the file. I went to bed. The trade accord was signed 4 days later. 3 hyperspace lanes changed hands. The Yhizari opened formal negotiations with the coalition within 2 months, which is what happens when the alternative becomes demonstrably worse. Ambassador Demas sent a brief message to the security coordination team after the signing. It thanked us for our service and noted that the summit had succeeded because of the combined efforts of many dedicated personnel. Marin Calloway was not mentioned by name. She would not have wanted to be.